Hi, it's Kara Swisher. I'm here in my new studio where I tape, pivot, and sway. I'm sorry about the lighting. I'm here with my two favorite people in tech, but it is a low bar.
Hey.
Steve, it is, Steve. Steve Case and Brian Chesky. And we're here talking about a bunch of things, including talent, rise of the rest, and some of the sort of lessons that Brian has learned through the pandemic in running a company and where the trends are going in the workplace and how people are working going forward and what's changed and what hasn't. So, Steve, why don't you fill us in just really quickly to start with on what you think sort of the important issues, everything is going to be defined by the pandemic. What do you think the important issues are that we face going forward?
Well, there's a lot of them. First of all, it's great to be with you, Karen. Great to be with you, Brian, as well. This is going to be a fun part of this whole focus on Rise of the Rest and the Tech Talent Tour this week. I think in terms of the pandemic, there's been a lot of focus on how certain trends which were bubbling have accelerated. People talk about e-commerce. People talk about telehealth. People talk about what's happening with the gaming and so forth. But I think the most fundamental is how this sort of what I think of as sort of a shake the snow globe moment changes how we think about work and think about life and sort of unbundles that. Historically, you always had to kind of live where you're working. And so you decided kind of what you wanted to do. And that kind of centered the rest of the decisions in your life, family, other kinds of things. There's clearly more flexibility because of the pandemic, because companies are adopting at least some of them remote work or at least hybrid work. And I think it can really accelerate this whole rise of the rest phenomenon. That part of the challenge we've been dealing with now for a decade that we've been working on this is that people left different parts of the country because there wasn't really a startup community there, wasn't really venture capital there wasn't really an innovation economy there, and as a result we saw this great brain drain. Now because of the pandemic, I think we can see an acceleration of the dispersion of talent. More cities rise up as strong startup ecosystems, and that could help level the playing field for the country. So of course the pandemic has been tragic in many respects, but even 600,000 people in this country alone have lost their lives. But a silver lining, perhaps, I hope, is that we'll see an acceleration of some of the trends around how talent moves, and we'll see this dispersion of talent all around the country and more cities rising up as great startup cities. Now, I want to say, particularly given the great success of Brian and Airbnb in Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley is the leader of the pack for sure. Will continue to be the leader of pack for sure. There's a lot of great things happening there. We just are looking for ways to support other cities so they have a chance to rise, and the entrepreneur in those cities can stay there and not feel like they have to leave. Maybe some of them might even return, kind of boomerang back, and we can have a more evenly dispersed innovation economy in our country, more jobs and opportunity all across the country.
One of the things you were talking about is the ability to do that, to create more cities. It hasn't really worked. The centers still stay the centers, whether it's Silicon Valley or New York or Austin. It hasn't moved significantly, despite the problems in California and this and that. It's mostly people moving there or working remotely. Now, this has been the biggest experiment in remote work in history, essentially. Brian, talk a little bit about the experience of Airbnb, because you all went completely remote immediately. Now, some tech companies are bringing their employees back. Apple's had a little kerfuffle with some of its employees over that issue. Some have said they can permanently stay away. Where have you done, just for your company first, then we can talk about the people that you serve, your customers?
Yeah, great question, Kara. So what we're doing at Airbnb, I'm on the side of more flexibility. I'm also one of those people that really believe it's hard to design a post-pandemic world in a pandemic. So we've decided that we're not going to require people to come back to the office until next September 2022. We'll gradually reopen the office if you need space. But I think the future is significantly more remote than anyone's giving credit for. And my prediction, even a month or two ago, was big tech companies and other tech companies were going to roll out these hybrid models that were going to be not that flexible, and that over time employees would push back, and that the employees, not the companies, will determine the policies because it's such a competitive market. And so I think what's going to happen is increasingly more companies are going to go more flexible. Now, what our actual design is, I don't know where it's going to be, but I don't know if it's going to be like 3 days in the office a week and then like 2 days not. I think it might be more immersive, where you can be more remote, but then there will be periods of time, like weeks at a time, where you're together. Because I think the 3 days a week, it still doesn't provide a huge amount of flexibility. So I think there's going to be a more flexible model than that.
Meaning intentional getting together. Like, here's the 3 weeks we're going to have.
Yeah, like here are the 3 weeks, but then otherwise you can be where you want to be. And that really affords people, if they want to go away for the summer, to actually go away for the summer. And this is something we're seeing on our business. I kind of felt like we should walk the talk. Our business is benefiting in a really big way because a quarter of our business are our monthly stays. And this, of course, is because what Steve said, if you unbundle where people live and work, they can literally work anywhere, they can live anywhere, and they can actually live remotely. And I felt like, well, we actually should be able to model this. So that's what we think is going to happen.
So one of the things, both of you, if you can answer this, I have a lot of friends who moved out of the city and lived in, and they went on and on about how wonderful it was in the remote areas or the suburbs. And then suddenly they're back in New York or something like that. Like all of them are back in New York, and New York is really bustling. I've been there a couple times recently, and it's really interesting. And they sort of dawned on a lot of people, they like to be in a city. And they like to be at work and things like that. When everyone's talking about this hybrid model and the idea of it, it's really good, Steve, for people who already lived in those places to be able to, for companies to tolerate it and having worked. Do you think it has worked for most companies besides tech companies, or is it just tech companies which have always been flexible in workplace initiatives?
As for me?
Yeah.
No, I think it's a mixed bag. I think this, as Brian said, this has been a grand experiment. And early on, people didn't quite know what was going to happen to different business. I remember, Brian, some of the moves they had to make early on in terms of their company, because suddenly the revenues business just kind of fell off the cliff. It suddenly got rebuilt, and now it looks like an acceleration, including a lot more people staying longer periods of time because of remote work. So I think different companies are going to have to play around with different things. It's going to be a grand experiment. I think the most important thing, though, is for a lot of people have been talking about telecommuting for 2 decades, maybe even longer, but it's always been this sort of fringy kind of thing. It's become much more mainstream. I think every organization has realized that the productivity actually is pretty high, some cases even higher over the past year. So how do they move back into this different world? I think the implication in terms of Rise the Rest and the folks that are participating in this tech talent tour, and right now there's 1,600 people signed up for it, about 25% were from California and New York, and thinking of moving to some other place. And so this whole week we've been talking about what's happening in different cities. There's over 1,000 jobs and 100 companies in 50 cities that are up for grabs as part of this effort. And I think it just is a signal that people are starting to rethink. You're right, cities are great. We've never believed that the entrepreneurship would end up being a rural phenomenon, but we do believe instead of it being a few cities, it could be a few dozen cities. And with Rise the Rest now, we visited 43 cities by bus. We've made seed investments in over 80 cities. And I think you're going to be surprised over the next decade how many of those cities really do indeed rise up.
And Brian, when you were talk about both your customers and your workforce, you guys went completely remote. Is that correct?
We went completely remote. We're completely remote. We have a very flexible policy, and we eventually will want some people back in the office sometimes. We decided not to rush back the design. And as I said, I'm not entirely convinced the Monday and Tuesday in the office, Wednesday you're home, Thursday in your office, Friday you're home. I'm not really convinced that's a really good model. Again, if you do want people back.
Why is that? Why do you not think it's a good model?
Well, because number one, you don't get a lot more flexibility than you did in the old world. Like, you get to have a 3-day weekend, but you can't really go away for weeks at a time. A lot of people are saying they're more productive now than they were before. Not everyone, but a lot of people are. Some people actually want to be able to live a month here, a month there. You don't get any of that flexibility, but you don't really get a huge affordance of being able to be heads down for days at a time. And so I think having something that's more of an immersion where you just predefine weeks at a time, weeks a quarter, and I don't know how many, where people are actually physically together. You have your planning meetings, but then you can be heads down. That seems to me a little more, it gives you more heads down time. It gives you more flexibility time. And if you want to be together, it's more meaningful time together. You can really count on this is the period people are together. And I think as far as how do I think people are going to live, I'm probably on the more radical side of believing that it's going to go. And I mean, I have my own view of travel. I'll start with travel because that's kind of where we're experts, but I can kind of maybe pontificate a little bit. I think that the days of people going to Times Square and Hollywood Boulevard and just a few cities are over. They're going to still go those places. But what we're seeing at Airbnb is this past year, even now, more people are going to Cornwall than London. And it's not that, it's just the point is that people are going everywhere. That suddenly it's not about going to a certain destination. I think business travel is never coming back the way it was. I think the new business travel 2.0 is going to be people traveling for weeks at a time to go back to headquarters. That's not going to be like a 1 or 2 day meeting. And I think you're going to basically see people going from a few cities to going everywhere. I think it used to be the place you had to be was New York, LA. Now the place you have to be is wherever your meeting is, and it's often on Zoom, it's often remote. And so I think that suddenly we're going to see a massive increase in mobility. And I think you're also going to see mobility not just within a country, but you're going to see people living in different countries for periods of time because they can if they're on the same time zone.
I suspect there'll also be, like many things, sort of a second order dynamic to what Ryan's saying, that as more people do think about work remote and can be living in other places for a week or a month or even a longer period of time, or when they're part of an existing company and they're allowed to work remotely the entire time, they will end up setting up shop, if you will, with their families in different cities, initially tethered to that existing company because that provides some continuity. But some of those people, not most of those people, but some of those people, once they're in that city, will see other things happening and likely start getting involved in what's happening, including in the startup community. That might lead them to decide to leave to go to some other company or maybe start some other company. So I think that's what's to watch. In the short run, it's going to be how do people stay, in most part, tethered to their existing company, but have more flexibility in terms of where they're working. But I suspect in the next 5 years or so, some of those people will end up moving into the startup community, which could be transformative to a lot of these rising cities.
Right. And so, Brian, when you're looking for talent, I mean, one of the things many years ago, I remember writing about Yahoo wanted to bring everyone back to the office. They didn't think people were very productive out of the office. That was the argument. Lazy was a word that was pushed out.
Yeah.
What has been your experience as a company with workers? I think most people have been more productive. I think
we've been significantly more productive. And I don't know if we've been like twice as productive, but it's not been 10% more productive. It's been like a step change in productivity. Now, it's a little hard to say because we also were in a crucible moment and we knew that Airbnb, so it's a little hard for me to be able to say how much was the company was on the line and it was an IPO. But I just think that there was just so much administration with the physical world. Like you have to show up to a meeting, you have to walk there. Meetings are more likely to be set periods of time when they're physical, whereas when they're remote, you can just do a phone call. If it's 7 minutes, it's 7 minutes. You don't have to fill the 30-minute slot. So I just think things can happen a lot faster when they're a lot more remote. I do think there's a reason for in-person collaboration. I don't think we should live in a world that's purely distributed where there's no human connection. That would be actually quite a dystopian world. I just don't think I think it's a very old-fashioned idea that if I can't see my employees working, they're not working. I think that's a very, very old-fashioned way of working, and I just don't think that's how the world works today. I think the best way to know if people are working is to look at the output of the company, and our output, we got more done last year than numerous years before that. We're just able to make faster decisions.
One of the reasons is no one had anything else to do. They couldn't go to movies, they couldn't go to, a lot of the things, couldn't go to restaurants and things like that. When people, is there a difficulty of creating a culture when it's not? I'm just thinking both of you, I'd like you to answer this. Brian, you spent a lot of money on that headquarters. It's quite stunning. And Steve, I remember going with Gene to pick out your headquarters. You did a whole campus. You did that was like such a big deal to have the big AOL campus out in the middle of nowhere, where now it's not the middle of nowhere. So each of you talk about that idea of a physical campus to create culture. Why don't you start, Steve? Because people don't know AOL was literally out in a cornfield. It was where
well, not quite. It was like 5 minutes from Dulles Airport. So that wouldn't go quite so far as call it a cornfield. But it was an area 25 years ago, I guess, when we made that decision where we needed that space and took over an existing British Aerospace campus and did feel that campus was together. But remember back 25 years ago, the model in the tech world, not just our company, but Microsoft and others, if they made an acquisition, they made you move to the headquarters. You had to move to Seattle to work if you were acquired by Microsoft. About 10 years ago, people realized that didn't really make sense. They acquired companies and then they kept them there and actually built them there. That's why Salesforce's second largest office now outside of San Francisco is Indianapolis. They have 2,000 employees because they acquired a company, ExactTarget. At the time had 1,000 employees. They've since doubled it. So now people are distributing their workforces, and this happened pre-pandemic. But I completely agree that there's something to working together, collaborating together, iterating together, particularly in that when you're trying to figure things out. It's better to be together. Once you know what you need to do and it's clear what the priorities are, that allows for more remote work. But one point that I think doesn't get enough attention is we got used to working together in a physical environment. Obviously, that's been true for the past century. Over the last 15, 16 months, we got used to working together remotely. Everybody was on the same, kind of level playing field. They were generally a box on a Zoom screen. The world we're moving into in terms of more of a hybrid structure where some people are in the office and some people are working remotely, I think it's going to be much trickier. It's going to be much trickier in terms of team dynamics, much trickier in terms of culture, much trickier in terms of trust. There's going to be a Hamilton phenomenon. You're not in the room where it happens. There's sort of a FOMO issue. So there's a lot of subtle things that I think we're going to have to experiment with over the next year or two. And it will vary depending on nature of your company and your culture and some of the challenges and opportunities you're focused on. But I actually think this last year, even how difficult it was with the pandemic, the next year is going to be more difficult because of the complexity of hybrid work.
What about you, Brian? You have another beautiful headquarters, different, but still in the middle of San Francisco. You're cutting back on that, correct? Or
Yeah. So we had 3 buildings, including one very large building, Zynga, which we no longer have, but we still have our main building. Mm-hmm. So we're still going to have an office. I mean, I to answer your question, Kara, I also don't subscribe to the 100% permanent remote. I mean, I just think that it's very hard to have empathy. It's one thing if you've met somebody, like we met in person, I met both of you, so now we can have Zoom. If you've never met somebody, there's just a dimension of the relationship missing. And I do think that's going to come at cost of finding common ground, empathy and compassion when everyone is just a square and you've never actually seen them in real life. And so I do think that the 100% remote, those companies will probably also start doing in-person offsites. And I think that most of these companies force people to come back to office are going to end up more remote. And most of these 100% remote companies are going to realize we are having a huge cultural cost by not bringing people together. So I think culture has to be built in person. And I think then you maintain it digitally. So we're going to still have our office. Again, we think of it more like a hub and spoke. We want to design a period of time where people can be generally pretty distributed, but they're going to come back and be together at key moments. And I don't know if that's like a week a quarter, many weeks a quarter, and then there will be some people that'll probably be in the office all the time. That's the post-pandemic world that we're talking about. And I think, again, it's a little hard because I think the other problem is people don't know what they want. If you asked an employee 3 months ago, they'd all say they want to go back in the office. Now it's summer, some people kind of don't want to go back to the office. And I think there's a little bit of a back and forth here. So we're going to have to find what the post-pandemic equilibrium is. The only other 2 points I'd make are, number one, there's a really good story here, which is that I think the candidate pool can be a lot wider and there's a lot more economic opportunity. We used to almost hire exclusively in San Francisco. The 26-year-old version of me, if I was 26 today, I wouldn't have been able to afford to move and live in San Francisco. I probably would have stayed somewhere else. And so I think we can reach talent that maybe never would have been able to come to San Francisco, or they just wouldn't have had the visibility of talent that we have today. I think the other thing is that I think this is a great equalizer to cities. This is not the end of San Francisco or the end of New York, but like I have told numerous politicians, I think they have to start thinking their citizens as customers, and those customers have choices. And I think that's the real fundamental place. You don't necessarily have to be anywhere. You have to now choose to be somewhere. And then now you just have to think of your residents as customers. And I think the employees, not the companies, are going to dictate the remote policies. Because the truth is, we're all going to do whatever we can to get the very best people. And there's a lot of studies showing now that people are going to quit jobs if they don't have remote policies. I mean, I think remote work will be the ultimate job perk.
And one thing we've seen in these rise and rest cities that I think ties in with what Brian's saying is it's one thing to get started. It's another thing to really scale, to go from a couple dozen people to hundreds of people to thousands of people. And that was a challenge in these rising cities. Now that, as Brian said, the talent pool is broader and you can tap into people with great expertise that are in other parts of the country, that's going to really advantage these companies that historically would sell too early to a larger company because they weren't able to get the talent they needed to scale it into its own independent, iconic, multi-billion-dollar company.
So when you have that idea, Steve, when you have, one of the things was you're trying to build companies within these cities in order to create talent pools within the cities. What's to stop an Airbnb or a Google from going all over the place and just controlling the talent in those cities? Because if they are allowing remote and they're hiring more remotely, does that quash innovation or or encourage it because they can now work for a Google or an Airbnb or an Amazon or a Facebook?
It will obviously cut both ways. Some will prefer working for a larger, more established company, whether they're in the city where the company's headquartered or elsewhere. Others will see it as an opportunity to be part of more of a startup world. And as you know, having followed this for a long time, there are people that want to be part of a earlier stage company, find it more exciting, feel more empowered, think they have more upside when the company gets to be a certain size. It's not really their cup of tea. I think it opens up opportunities for some of those people to rethink about what they want to do with this unbundling of where they're living and where they're working. And so I think overall, the company, as I said earlier, the companies in these rise of the rest cities, and again, we've invested in 80 different cities, and a lot of great companies that are coming out of those cities will be able to tap into this national, even global talent pool as they move into that blitzscaling mode, as opposed to feeling like they really have to be in one of those superstar cities like a San Francisco or New York in order to be able to take the company to the next level. But clearly it'll be a mix of things. And we're even seeing that when companies open in headquarters or a second office. Facebook has done this, Google's done this in Detroit and Pittsburgh, other places. Amazon obviously picked the DC area for its second headquarters. It does pull some talent into their orbit, but also it unleashes a lot of talent from those companies that do become a magnet, do get thousands of people into their company. Some of those people over time will move into the startup sector. That should fuel these rising cities and help a lot of entrepreneurs in a lot of places.
So, Brian, how would you start a startup today if you were doing that? How would you think about it? I mean, there have been distributed companies for a long time. A lot of game companies, for example, hire people all over the world, Latvia, Russia, different places like that.
Yeah.
But how would you start a company today? You all were all together in a space during a time.
I think I would still want my co-founders and I to be in the same city, because I just think there's such as Steve knows, and it can be so intense that the amount of trust you need in a company needs to be so high that I think if you never meet people, you might be missing something. But I don't think I think we would totally have been open to being fairly distributed after the founding team. I probably would want a couple of the core people in the core city. But if we were starting Airbnb today, I'm the 26-year-old. I'm probably still living maybe in San Francisco, maybe I'm living somewhere else with my two co-founders. But I think our first 10 employees, maybe 2 of them work in our city and maybe a couple others. I think everyone's within a 3-hour time zone. Mm-hmm. But I think they would be potentially distributed. That would be my instinct. But I would probably design us to be together maybe once a quarter for a couple of weeks. I wouldn't have people just seeing them once a year. I also don't think I'd be able to maintain a relationship strong enough.
What about you, Steve?
No, same. First of all, I'd be open to different cities based on some of these, third wave industries, healthcare, food and ag, and so forth, where some of the key partners you want to, work with are in different parts of the country. Some of the cities have great expertise in those sectors, like Minnesota and Ohio around healthcare. One of the companies we backed in Chattanooga, Tennessee, FreightWaves, is focused on a Bloomberg-like data platform for the trucking industry. I didn't know this, but most of the big trucking companies are headquartered in Chattanooga. It's kind of like the Silicon Valley of trucking. So it's better to be in one of those places. So I think you have to pick the place based on partly where you want to live, but also what the expertise you want to tap into, what partnerships you want to form. There's a reason why the whole Northwest Arkansas area has flourished, because Walmart has been successful and people wanting to work with Walmart wanted to be close to them, and therefore in Northwest Arkansas. So pick the industry you want to focus on, pick the place where you think it's good to launch that company, but also where you prefer to kind of live and raise a family, and then tap into the global pool of talent.
So, Brian, one of the things is not just your company within Airbnb, but mixing with other people. You have hung out with Mark Zuckerberg, both early in your careers, like the idea of everybody being in a place and creating an atmosphere of a place. How do you replicate that when you're in these, when you want to have people live wherever they want, but you don't get that kind of back and forth thinking of the venture capitalists of the universities and things like that?
It's a good question, and I don't know if I have a full answer. I mean, I came here in 2007 and 2008. I remember part of the reason that I got into tech was because I was in a city where it was all happening. I mean, my third roommate, other than my co-founder, worked for Justin.tv, which was in Y Combinator, introduced us to Paul Graham. And so the network was really, really small. That being said, I'm not sure who's physically meeting that much right now today. My instinct is that going forward in the future, again, I'm trying to put myself back in the shoes of somebody starting a company. My instinct is it would be fine to live kind of anywhere, but I'd have to have two requirements. Number one, I would have to be digitally connected. So I'd have to have some kind of ways to connect with other people. I don't know if that's like social media or other kind of different online communities. But I also think that physical communities are going to have to rise, whether they're like people going back to conferences, or I have this feeling that, like, you know, a lot of companies, whatever they say their policy is, they're all going to be totally 100% remote 3 months a year, and that will be summer. That's my prediction. And I think we're going to have to see is entrepreneurs potentially clustering, flying in, spending weeks together, clustering. I think you're going to start to see either conferences bringing people together or people self-organizing. And I think like getting to know people, self-organizing, hey, everyone's going to be in this city. Let's all like go to X place for a while. I think you're going to start to see more of that kind of clustered mobility. If it's not organized through conferences, it might be self-organized. I think those are going to probably be things that I'll see, and that's probably what I would do.
So that's Europe. You're describing Europe in that.
Yeah, I guess so.
Summer. What about you, Steve? What do you think? How does that work when you don't have a community? Now, you started in Washington, and you know there wasn't as many people there. They're just, you know, you did not start in Silicon Valley.
There is something to the clustering, no question. Part of the reason with the Rise Rest, we spent a lot of time networking together, entrepreneurs and cities and even venture capitals. We've co-invested now with 350 regional venture capitalists to create more of that network density. That is one of the great things about Silicon Valley. But you don't have to physically be all together. If there's one lesson of the last year, I think that's the lesson. So the ability to create these networks that do connect entrepreneurs with investors and partners and others becomes even more important. And that's what has been a key focus for Rise the Rest for most of the past decade.
Okay, so right now, when you think about the cities that are exciting, and a lot of cities are making a play for it, and they all sort of want to be the Silicon Valley of, which I think is sort of a silly idea in many ways. What do you think? Where do you think is exciting? I mean, Miami's trying to make it happen all over the place, and they've got a lot of people going yammering on about it. But is there one exciting place that each of you thinks is interesting? I don't think you're moving to Miami, Brian. I get the sense that you're not. He laughs.
I'll let Steve start.
Well, again, since we've now done our Rise Rest tour in 43 cities and invested in over 80 cities, it's a little bit like asking, what's your favorite child?
Yeah,
I ducked the question. But in all honesty, I think what you'll see in the next 20 years is dozens of cities rise up that are really built on leveraging some of the expertise they have, which will become more important in the future. So it's not kind of Silicon Valley or San Francisco area plus New York plus Boston, and suddenly we're adding an Austin to it, or adding a Seattle to it, or adding an LA to it. And it's going to be far broader than that. And we're seeing this also across our Revolution portfolio. We have a couple dozen growth investments, a couple dozen venture investments, over 100 of the Rise the Rest seed investments. And we're seeing a lot of things happening in cities that most people didn't think were startup cities. With Eric Lefkowski's building in Chicago with Tempest, now nearly 2,000 employees, focusing on precision medicine. Most people have thought that had to be in Silicon Valley or had to be in Boston. And I'd remind you that 10 years ago, LA was not a startup city. I remember investing in a fund that was struggling to raise a first-time $8 million fund. Now they have over $500 million under management. LA is now viewed as a strong startup city. We back Sweetgreen there, and Tala there, and Scopely there, and other companies as well. It's now a robust startup city, even though it's not at the same level of San Francisco or New York. So these things are rising up, and I think people are going to be quite surprised over the next 10 or 20 years. Maybe even you, Kara, how many of these cities really do emerge? It's not one or two that are going to join the superstar startup cities. It's going to be far broader than that.
Steve, I've always been remote. I'm way ahead of everybody else.
You're not going back to the office.
I never went to the office. I did it out of my back of my house. I don't like people in the office, Brian. I'm very uncomfortable in a workplace situation. All right, Brian, what about you? Is there anywhere exciting? And then the last question I'll have for both of you is, what has to happen in these cities for them to become that? I know everybody has access, everybody has Zoom, but there's something else that each of them need. Brian, is there anywhere you think is exciting?
Well, I'll give a plug to Atlanta because we're opening a technology hub in Atlanta. It's a place with great universities. It's a very diverse city, and we're having a lot of success finding really good talent in Atlanta. So we created an East Coast technical hub in Atlanta, and I think it's a great city. But again, I think basically, my view would be, I don't think Silicon Valley will ever get recreated. And I don't think Silicon Valley will ever quite be what it was, because I think the whole point is you'll never need to be in one place quite like you used to. It doesn't mean there won't be benefits to all being in one place. It doesn't mean there won't be clusters of people. It's just that, like, this is the worst video technology will ever be ever again, right? It's only going to be better. Like, bandwidth's going to improve, screen technology is going to improve. We're going to have more tools for connection. It's going to get even easier. So I think, like, this is a moment in time. It's going to get even more seamless. And so I think suddenly people are going to have to go places they want to be. And I think, as Steve said, there's dozens of cities. I had in my head hundreds of cities maybe, and I'm thinking around the world. So I think it's going to be extremely distributed. The place to be will be the internet. You can access it anywhere. So I think you're going to see a lot of medium, small cities rising up.
One historical kind of point here to build on what Brian's saying is most people, 50 years ago thought if you wanted to be in the entertainment business, you had to be in Hollywood. There was no way to participate. That's not so true anymore. There's advantages of being in Hollywood, but entertainment, music, movies, things like that are really now created all over the world. Similarly, 50 years ago, if you wanted to be in the financial service industry, you had to be at Wall Street. You had to be in New York City. There still are advantages for some to be in New York City, but again, the whole financial services world has become far more dispersed. So I think that's what's going to happen in terms of the innovation economy. Silicon Valley will be like a Hollywood or be like a New York, still the leader of the pack, still a magnet, still an icon, but we'll see the innovation economy disperse more broadly all across the country, and as Brian said, really all across the world.
All right, last question. If you look at the last 12 to 18 months, what is the one tool you think has gotten great, and what is the one tool that you just are like, that's enough of that? That didn't work out well in terms of working remotely and creating these kind of presences.
Brian, why don't you start?
The one tool that's worked and the one tool that hasn't worked. I don't know if I have an incredibly, clearly, I had never really we had used WebEx before the pandemic. I'd never used Zoom. The first day I used Zoom was, I think, the day the World Health Organization declared a pandemic. So I have found that I thought I'd be exhausted by Zoom meetings. I'm not as exhausted, and I find us to be significantly more productive. So I find that most all the collaboration tools are even better than they were. And I think what the pandemic did is enforced 100% of people to use the tools. Before, half the people were on some tools, half the people weren't. As far as something that didn't work as well as I thought it would, I don't know if I have an answer to that. I don't know if Steve, you do, but I will say that, I do think that people have overestimated how much will return back to normal. I think the world's never going back to the way it was. And so I think a lot of people have in their mind, New York will be back and people will all be back in the office. Well, New York might be back, but not because it will look anything like it did. If half the industries have changed, the whole world is not going to go back to the way it was. Travel's not going back. Business travel is not going back. The way work is not going back. So I that would be my general view. And I think the things that haven't worked as well, I would just generally say, I think maybe this is not exactly answer your question, but I think and this kind of answers the question you asked before, I think cities are going to have to compete for talent. And I think the cities that win will be the cities that most welcome talent. Because I think cities are going to be like apps, and you can download any app, you can go. In a world with more mobility, it's actually easier. Even with Airbnb, you actually can get a house for 3 months. You don't need to sign a lease. You don't need first month's rent. You don't need to put it on deposit. You can uproot pretty quickly. And so people have a lot more choice. So I think cities just really competing with talent by being very friendly and open, I think, whatever that means. It could be tax policy. It's mostly just, hey, we're open for business. We'd love to have you here. I think that's a big sign for people.
And just add to that it's not just true for cities, it's true for countries, which is why one of the key areas of focus in the coming year will be immigration reform. How do we win the global battle for talent, which our country is beginning to lose? There are fewer people coming from different countries to get PhDs here. There are fewer of the people getting PhDs who are staying here. So if we're going to continue to be the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world, we have to continue to be a welcoming people from all around the world and be that magnet for talent. I'd say in terms of your question, I agree with the first part in terms of how Zoom and other technologies have enabled people to be quite productive. What I saw early on, it's getting a little bit better now, is particularly in the venture capital world, particularly in the startup world, you were spending a lot of time with existing people in your network, but you weren't expanding your aperture, opening your network to other people. And it became sort of self-reinforcing and self-limiting, and which also disadvantages not just people in other places, but people from different backgrounds. And as you know, the data on venture capital is quite sobering. 75% of venture capital goes to just 3 states. That's a problem. How do we spread that around the country? But also, even though women are 50% of the population, they get less than 10% of venture capital, female founders. Black Americans are 13% of the population. They get less than 1% of venture capital. So we really do need to do a job of leveling the playing field for place and for people. And there are cities, and Brian mentioned Atlanta, I was just there a few weeks ago. They and other cities are really focusing on this kind of front and center, how to be not just a great startup city, but the most inclusive startup city. And that's an area where if you're all on Zoom, you're only going to invite people you already know. How do you figure out ways to reach out to other people? That's obviously what we're trying to do with Rise Rest, and that's the whole point of this focus this week on talent. How do we connect people to other people and to ideas and to cities and give them a broader perspective of what might be possible? If we're successful in doing that, the companies we back will be more successful, but the cities we're investing in and helping try to build up also will be stronger, and that will, I think, really result in a stronger country. We're obviously divided on many levels, in part because of this opportunity gap. People talk about income inequality gap, which is definitely there. There's also an opportunity gap. We need to close that gap by creating more opportunity, including in the innovation economy, for more people and more places. Otherwise, this divide in this country will get worse. This is an opportunity to at least in some small way, to kind of bring us together by focusing everybody on the opportunities in the future and everybody having more of a reason to be optimistic about the future as opposed to anxious about what's going to happen in terms of new technology. Excellent.
I think the best thing that's happened is Dolly Parton. And if we all just moved to Pigeon Forge, we would all.
All right.
Well, actually, don't move to Pigeon.
Dolly's a great entrepreneur. Amazing.
She is, indeed. She is. All right. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. And good luck with the rest of your conference.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian.
Bye.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kara.